In 1969, a man twice his age walked onto a studio floor to expose him. Minutes later, the room had gone quiet. The challenger would never publicly question him again. There were no dramatic speeches. No visible anger. Only a brief exchange, and a shift in how everyone present understood mastery. Los Angeles in 1969 was a city in transition. The film industry was changing. Television had become faster, louder, more commercial. Martial arts schools, once hidden behind modest storefronts, were beginning to attract actors, stunt performers, and men looking for something disciplined in a restless decade. Techniques that had traveled quietly from Asia were now being demonstrated under studio lights. Bruce Lee had already built a reputation in certain circles. He was known for his speed, for his intensity, for the way he corrected movements with small, efficient adjustments rather than long explanations. Among his students were recognizable faces. Some came for skill. Others came for proximity to what they sensed was emerging. But reputation in that era was fragile. Traditionalists watched carefully. Many had trained within rigid hierarchies for decades. Belt systems, formal kata, tournament trophies, these were the measures they trusted. Lee did not fit easily into those structures. He had begun to speak about simplicity, about discarding what was unnecessary, about directness over display. Some admired it. Others considered it impatience disguised as innovation. The studio where the incident would later unfold was not a grand arena. It was an open floor space. Polished wood, mirrors along one wall, equipment stacked neatly in the corner. Heavy bags hung quietly when not in use. On most days, instruction there was methodical. Lee moved between students correcting stances, adjusting guard positions, shortening punches that traveled too far. He was not theatrical during training. Observers recall that he conserved movement even when demonstrating. There was no waste in his gestures. If he corrected a strike, it was by inches. If he demonstrated speed, it was brief. Then he would step back and let silence settle. By 1969, his name circulated beyond his immediate circle. Articles had begun appearing. Demonstrations had been witnessed. Some tournament fighters had tested distance with him informally and left unsettled. Word of mouth built momentum faster than printed praise. Yet outside admiration always attracts examination. In martial arts communities of the time, authority was often measured publicly. Demonstrations were common. Challenges were not always hostile, but they were intentional. If someone claimed exceptional speed, another might quietly request to test it. Not in anger, in verification. Bruce Lee understood this culture. He had grown up in Hong Kong where street confrontations and schoolyard rivalries were common. Later, in America, he encountered skepticism of a different kind. There were instructors who doubted that a man of his build could possess the stopping power he implied. Others questioned his critique of classical forms. He was younger than many who had trained for decades. Age alone in those rooms carried weight. Lee did not respond to doubt with speeches. He trained. Students who attended his classes recall repetition, not flamboyance. Intercepting fists practiced thousands of times. Footwork refined to reduce fractions of a second. Emphasis on timing over strength. He often said little during sessions. He demonstrated, corrected, then observed. By the late 1960s, something else had begun to shift. He was no longer simply an instructor among many. He was becoming a reference point. Fighters spoke of his reaction speed with a certain hesitation. Not excitement, caution. Stories circulated of opponents unable to complete a movement before being touched. These accounts were not widely documented, but they traveled quietly between gyms. Still, among established champions of the previous generation, skepticism remained intact. Tournament circuits had their own legends. Men who had accumulated titles, who had faced large brackets of competitors, who carried certificates signed by respected masters. In their world, skill was measured in rings under observation, not in private studios. Bruce Lee rarely competed in tournaments in America. That absence left space for doubt. Some interpreted his avoidance of formal competition as strategic. Others interpreted it as concealment. Without official trophies, his authority rested on witness testimony and personal encounters. In martial culture, that can be enough or it can invite challenge. On most days, the studio floor where he trained remained calm. Students bowed in. They warmed up. They practiced combinations. Outside, Los Angeles traffic moved indifferently past the building. Inside, discipline maintained order. But beneath that routine, a quiet tension had begun to gather. Lee's methods were not only different, they were direct critiques of established systems. He spoke of efficiency, of eliminating unnecessary forms, of intercepting rather than reacting. For some older practitioners, this sounded like dismissal of traditions they had dedicated their lives to preserving. He did not attack those traditions personally. Yet by demonstrating alternatives, he placed them in contrast. Authority does not like contrast. Several individuals in the martial arts community had already tested him informally. Most encounters ended without spectacle. A brief exchange, a moment of recalibration, then departure. No public declarations followed, but each of those moments contributed to an undercurrent. By 1969, Bruce Lee stood at a subtle crossroads. He was respected by many younger fighters and actors. He was observed cautiously by established champions. He had not yet become the global icon history would later remember, but within certain circles, his presence carried gravity. Gravity invites weight. The day Victor Moore would walk into that training space did not begin with confrontation. There was no announcement, no scheduled exhibition. Students were practicing as usual. Yet, in the broader environment of the martial arts community, the conditions for a test had already formed. Lee represented something unproven yet unsettling. Moore represented something established and documented. One was innovation moving quickly. The other was tradition standing firmly. When such currents intersect, they do not always collide loudly. Sometimes they meet in a quiet room, under steady lights, in front of witnesses who sense that what is about to happen will not require many words. By the time Moore's presence would be felt on that floor, the atmosphere had already prepared itself. Authority was about to be measured not through argument but through distance, timing, and a single exchange. The studio remained silent that afternoon. But silence in certain rooms is not emptiness. It is anticipation. Victor Moore did not enter the room as an agitator. He was already established long before Bruce Lee's name began circulating in Hollywood circles. A decorated karate champion. A man who had competed in structured tournaments where judges watched carefully and outcomes were recorded in brackets. His generation valued visible proof, titles earned in front of crowds, techniques refined within codified systems. He carried himself with that assurance. When he stepped into the studio, there was no raised voice. No immediate confrontation. Those present later recalled that he observed first. He watched Lee instruct, watched the corrections, watched the speed at which hands seemed to travel from stillness to contact and back again. Moore had heard the stories, that Lee's punches were too fast to block, that he could strike from distances others miscalculated, that his philosophy rejected rigidity in favor of adaptation. Stories, however, are not evidence. Moore belonged to a culture where claims were tested. At some point, accounts differ slightly on sequence but not on tone. He made his position clear. He did not accuse Lee of fraud. He did not insult him. Instead, he questioned a specific assertion. Speed. More precisely, the claim that Lee could land a strike before a trained fighter could react. Moore stated calmly that he could block any punch Lee attempted to throw at him. It was not shouted. It was offered as a controlled statement of confidence. The room shifted subtly. Students who had been stretching paused without appearing to pause. Conversations thinned. Even those unfamiliar with more understood that this was not casual conversation. In martial arts communities, such a statement carries weight. It is not rhetorical. It is an invitation. Lee did not answer immediately. Witnesses would later remark that he did not appear offended. Nor did he seem amused. He listened. His posture remained relaxed. He studied more the way he studied any opponent. Eyes attentive, shoulders loose, breathing steady. Moore was older, larger, a man accustomed to facing challengers across tournament mats. His stance reflected years of training within traditional forms. Balanced, structured, prepared to respond. What separated the two men was not hostility. It was philosophy. Moore represented a system built on anticipation and response. Guard high. Wait for the attack. Counter with discipline. Lee's approach centered on interception. Do not wait. Do not trade movements. Close the gap before the opponent organizes defense. To Moore, blocking a punch was a test of reflex and structure. To Lee, landing one was a test of timing and economy. The difference would define the outcome. But in that moment, none of that was spoken. Moore reiterated his claim with measured composure. He would block any punch thrown at him. The implication was clear. If Lee's speed were as extraordinary as reported, this was the opportunity to demonstrate it. Some in the room felt tension. Others felt curiosity. A few sensed inevitability. Lee's response was brief. He agreed. No conditions beyond simplicity. Noi la verazze tup. Just distance measured between two men facing one another on polished wood flooring. It is important to understand that this was not a sanctioned bout. There were no judges. No referee. No crowd beyond a handful of observers who happened to be present. The stakes were intangible yet significant. Reputation. Moore had competed publicly for years. His credentials were documented. If he succeeded in blocking Lee's strike, it would temper the growing myth around the younger man. If he failed, something unspoken would shift. Lee stepped forward. He did not adopt a theatrical stance. No deep, exaggerated posture. His body appeared almost casual, as if preparing for a standard training drill. But those who knew him recognized the stillness that preceded movement. Moore positioned himself deliberately, guard ready, eyes focused. His confidence did not appear forced. He had blocked countless strikes in his career. Tournament matches had conditioned him to read shoulders, hips, intent. He expected a visible initiation, a tell. Lee's hands rested lightly. There was no countdown, no verbal signal. Only two practitioners standing at measured distance, each representing a different generation's understanding of combat. In such moments, time behaves differently. Observers often describe it stretching. Small adjustments become noticeable. A shift of weight, a tightening of jaw muscles, a narrowing of eyes. Moore waited for the beginning of motion. Lee was already calculating distance. He did not rush. He did not circle dramatically. He made minute adjustments to his position, barely perceptible to untrained eyes. For Lee, range was everything. The difference between contact and failure was measured in inches. Moore maintained his guard. The claim had been made publicly enough that withdrawal was no longer an option. Yet there was no hostility in his expression, only resolve. If he blocked the strike, it would confirm the reliability of traditional defense against exaggerated reputation. Lee exhaled slowly. Witnesses would later disagree on the exact mechanics of what followed, but not on the result. Before the demonstration occurred, there was one final moment of stillness. And in that stillness, the atmosphere in the room condensed. The challenge had been issued. The agreement had been made. No one spoke further. Authority was about to move from language to action. The studio had grown quiet in ways that were almost imperceptible. Students and onlookers had clustered near the edges of the polished floor. None spoke. Conversations that had begun during warm-ups ceased mid-sentence. Even the faint creak of the wooden boards seemed louder. It was not excitement. It was attention concentrated, as if the room itself were waiting. Moore held his stance, arms raised in measured guard. His eyes did not waver. He had prepared for countless challenges in tournament rings. He understood risk, reaction, and timing. Yet the situation was different here. No referee. No round system. No applause at the end. Only observation and the silent weight of reputation. Lee remained still, almost casual but not careless. Observers later described the subtle shifts he made, small adjustments in balance, a tiny lowering of his center of gravity, a nuanced repositioning of his lead foot. Nothing theatrical, nothing meant to intimidate, yet every movement was calculated, every inch measured. Time contracted. In that moment, anticipation became tangible. Witnesses recall a sense that something was about to prove itself beyond words. Moore's calm confidence contrasted sharply with the quiet tension that permeated the room. For Moore, the test was straightforward. Block any strike. Uphold his skill. Protect his standing. For Lee, it was different. There was no performance, no desire to impress. Only precision. Only clarity. Only the understanding that skill, when fully realized, speaks without declaration. Observers remember the silence as oppressive, not in a dramatic sense but as the stillness before something inevitable. A few students later said they could feel the weight of generations in that room. Old-school discipline confronting new understanding, tradition measuring innovation. Moore's mind was prepared for physical action. Years of tournament experience had trained him to anticipate, react, and respond. He scanned Lee's shoulders, watching for initiation cues, testing his reaction window. In his world, blocking meant prediction, speed, and control. Lee did not move in obvious ways. He adjusted slightly, imperceptibly, calibrating distance. There was no verbal cue, no signal. Observers noted that it was almost as if Lee had slowed the room itself. The air thickened with quiet calculation. The dynamic was psychological as much as it was physical. Moore had claimed he could block any strike. Lee had agreed. Now, all that remained was the demonstration. Yet even before it occurred, the tension had shifted. Authority was no longer in debate. It had become a question of evidence. Everyone in the room sensed that what was about to occur would be brief. Yet its significance would endure. Seconds stretched. The kind of seconds where a single blink could alter perception. Moore's breathing was controlled. His gaze steady. Lee's posture suggested readiness without anticipation. The quiet was not an absence of energy. It was energy concentrated, measured, restrained. Students later said it felt like holding a weight in the air. Visible, palpable, but impossible to touch. Then Lee began a subtle movement. Not a step, not a swing, not a flourish. A minute shift in body alignment, almost imperceptible, yet enough to alter the distance between them. Observers described the sensation as the world tilting slightly, as if the expected sequence of action, the challenge, the block, the claim, was being quietly rewritten. Moore's reaction, trained and disciplined as it was, could not adjust to the shift in timing and spacing. The moment before impact seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. For Moore, blocking was no longer a question of skill. It was a question of inevitability. And then the strike happened. It was brief, minimal, efficient. There was no flourish, no windup, just a small, precise motion from Lee's hand, timed so perfectly that Moore could not intercept it. The impact, though light, carried authority. The strike was over almost before it began. The room remained frozen, not shocked in excitement, not screaming in awe, but in attentive acknowledgement. Students whispered later that you could hear a pin drop, though no pin had fallen. Moore did not stumble. He did not collapse. He remained upright, but the expression on his face shifted subtly. A tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, an imperceptible recognition that something he had prepared for his entire career had occurred faster than he could react. No one spoke. Lee did not celebrate. His face remained neutral. Hands relaxed to his sides. The lesson had been delivered, not proclaimed. The authority had shifted. Evidence had been established, and it required no commentary. It was a demonstration so brief, so precise, that many present later said it could easily be missed if one blinked. Yet its effect lingered far longer than its duration. In those moments, the psychological tension of the room resolved. Moore, the challenger, remained composed outwardly, but the unspoken acknowledgement had been made. Lee's mastery was not contested, debated, or argued. It was simply observed, quietly, efficiently, and definitively. The room held its breath for a long moment after. Then, slowly, conversation resumed, but differently. Respect, observation, and recognition had replaced skepticism. The test had been executed, and the evidence was clear. Authority in that studio had moved without spectacle, and the quiet momentum of that moment carried forward, unnoticed by anyone beyond those present, like a stone dropped in water whose ripples extend far beyond sight. The space between them seemed smaller than it had moments before, though no one moved closer. Lee's posture had not changed dramatically. There was no flaring of fists, no exaggerated readiness. He shifted minutely, a subtle adjustment of his lead foot, a slight lowering of his center of gravity. Nothing a casual observer would notice. Yet these inches, these fractions of weight, were enough. Moore, trained to respond to visual cues, maintained his guard. Eyes focused. Hands up. Muscles coiled like springs. He had faced countless opponents in tournaments, had reacted to strikes faster than most men could process. His confidence was unshaken, built over decades of practice and measured victories. Lee did not speak. He did not signal. He waited for the natural opening created by distance, rhythm, and timing. Then, in a motion almost imperceptible, his hand extended. Not a swing, not a wind-up, a straight, linear movement that covered the shortest possible distance from start to finish. Every ounce of motion was minimized, every millisecond conserved. Moore reacted instinctively as he had countless times before. He shifted, attempted to intercept, but it was already too late. The strike connected, not in a dramatic way, but in a precise, undeniable manner. Moore felt the touch before he could adjust. He had blocked thousands of attacks, yet the speed and timing here defied expectation. The strike required no force to demonstrate authority. It was the efficiency of motion, the inevitability of execution, that spoke. Witnesses later said the moment lasted barely a heartbeat, but its impression lingered far longer. The room, which had held its breath, did not erupt. There was no cheering. There was no laughter, just an acknowledgement in the way students shifted, a slight intake of air, a subtle leaning forward from those closest. Moore did not fall. He did not strike back. He remained upright, guard still raised. But the expression on his face changed. Recognition, quiet and controlled, replaced confidence. It was not humiliation. It was comprehension, a measured understanding that the rules he had trusted, the rules of anticipation, of blocking, of tournament reflex, had been silently overridden by something different. Lee's demonstration was complete. There was no repetition, no attempt to overwhelm. He did not smile. He did not glance at Moore to gloat. The authority he had asserted through motion required no confirmation. The evidence stood on its own. Observers later described the room as heavy with a new understanding. They had not witnessed a performance. They had witnessed precision, control, mastery rendered visible in a single, minimal act. Moore lowered his guard after a moment, not because he conceded verbally, but because there was nothing left to test. The claim had been met. The response had been decisive. The lesson, though brief, was clear. The quiet after the strike lasted longer than the demonstration itself. Students remained attentive, not to see more, but to process what had occurred. Whispers were exchanged, not in excitement, but in acknowledgement. The physical demonstration had shifted perception without spectacle. Lee stepped back, posture unchanged, breathing steady. He did not invite applause. He did not ask for acknowledgement. The authority of that single motion was sufficient. The room itself seemed to settle, the air recalibrating to reflect the new hierarchy established in those few seconds. What had begun as a challenge ended quietly. Not through argument, not through noise, not through prolonged confrontation, but through evidence. The psychological impact was immediate, though subtle. Moore's confidence, built over years, remained intact in demeanor. But the unspoken understanding that a level of skill existed beyond traditional measurement had entered the room. Students and witnesses absorbed it silently. There were no grand statements, no retelling in triumph. The demonstration, minimal and decisive, spoke louder than any words could. And in that calm, controlled moment, mastery had been rendered undeniable. The strike had ended, but its echoes remained. Moore did not step back. He did not shake his head or protest. He remained composed, adjusting subtly, as if reorganizing his stance to reconcile what had just occurred. Observers later recalled a quiet dignity in his posture. There was no public defeat, no grand gesture of acknowledgement, only an imperceptible recalibration of understanding. Lee, for his part, did not react. Hands relaxed to his sides. Eyes steady, breathing calm. The room had absorbed the demonstration, and he allowed the moment to settle. He did not need to assert authority further. The action itself had spoken. Students whispered later that they noticed how Lee's expression never changed. There was no triumph, no satisfaction. Only neutrality, control, precision. The implication was clear. Mastery does not seek validation. It is self-evident. Those present, both students and casual witnesses, felt a shift in the atmosphere. Conversations resumed slowly, hesitantly. Movements were measured. Even the creak of the floorboards seemed subdued. The public tension that had hung in the air dissipated quietly, replaced by observation and reflection. Moore, after a few seconds, lowered his guard. He nodded subtly, acknowledgement without concession. No words were necessary. He had seen the difference between practice speed and inevitable precision, between experience and instinct refined into action. The psychological collapse was subtle, not theatrical. It did not require shouting or dramatization. It occurred in the realization that preparation and anticipation, however rigorous, could be rendered ineffective by control, timing, and economy of motion. The room's hierarchy had shifted without argument, spectacle, or debate. Students later described the silence that followed as more impactful than the strike itself. It was a quiet kind of understanding, the kind that lingers. Everyone sensed that something significant had been demonstrated, not in force but in mastery. Observers took note of one final detail. Lee did not look to Moore, nor did he seek approval from anyone present. His presence alone carried authority. The demonstration had been sufficient. Evidence, not commentary, had settled the question. The day continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Warm-ups resumed. Techniques were practiced. Yet the memory of the encounter remained with those who had witnessed it. What had been public tension had become private reflection. What had begun as a challenge had become a subtle lesson in restraint, precision, and quiet authority. Years later, students would recall that afternoon not for the strike itself, but for the stillness that followed, the recognition that mastery is not declared. It is demonstrated once, silently, and then allowed to speak for itself. Years later, the story persisted, not in newspapers, not in flashy magazine covers, but in quiet recollection. Students, instructors, and practitioners retold it in hushed tones, not to boast, but to illustrate a moment that had shifted perception without spectacle. Bruce Lee's demonstration became a reference point in discussions about mastery. It was not about defeating Victor Moore. It was about how skill, timing, and psychological control could render debate obsolete. Those who had been present described the encounter not as a confrontation, but as a lesson in inevitability. That authority, once earned and exercised, does not require repetition or amplification. Victor Moore continued his career, respected and accomplished, yet he carried the subtle imprint of that day. He did not speak disparagingly of Lee, nor did he diminish his own achievements. Instead, in conversations years later, he acknowledged the efficiency and precision he had witnessed. To Moore, the encounter was not a loss but a calibration, an understanding that a single act of controlled mastery could rewrite expectations. For the students who observed, the story served as a quiet benchmark. They did not rush to emulate flashy moves or speed for spectacle. Instead, they internalized the idea that mastery is measured by the impact of a single, decisive action, executed with restraint and clarity. The strike itself was brief, but its influence extended over decades. Even among martial artists who had never seen it, the tale circulated as an example of what it means to control space, timing, and presence. It became a lesson in psychological authority. How calm observation, calculated action, and minimal motion can establish dominance far more effectively than aggression or volume. The studio where it occurred remained ordinary. The boards creaked as before. Mirrors reflected practice sessions. Yet anyone who knew the story sensed that the floor had once borne witness to something exceptional. A demonstration that was quiet, efficient, and irrevocable. Bruce Lee's legacy in this context was defined less by trophies or film appearances, and more by these moments of quiet authority. One precise strike, one controlled motion, one silence that carried more weight than any words could. The anecdote became part of a larger understanding. That true skill does not demand recognition, and influence does not require proclamation. Decades later, students and practitioners still referenced the encounter as a benchmark of excellence. They would recall how Moore, composed and skilled, faced the strike and adjusted his understanding. How Lee, calm and neutral, demonstrated mastery without spectacle. How the room itself seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the inevitability of authority expressed through action. The story endured because it was simple, direct, and observable. A single demonstration, a quiet assertion of control, a psychological imprint that outlasted its immediate participants. In martial arts, and in life, the anecdote serves as a reminder. Mastery is shown, not told. Authority is exercised, not declared. Influence is measured in moments of silent precision that resonate long after the act itself has concluded. And so the encounter between Bruce Lee and Victor Moore, brief as it was, became legend not for confrontation, but for the clarity it revealed, the quiet it demanded, and the understanding it left in its wake. The studio returned to routine, but the story did not. It lived in memory, in retelling, in the subtle shift of perspective that occurs when evidence, not argument, defines reality. Silence, control, and inevitability became the enduring markers of that day, a benchmark quietly etched into martial history.